Hi, everybody. There's that enthusiasm I heard about. This is my 6th year here, so it's pretty exciting, and it's so awesome that you all keep coming back to listen to all the great content that shows up here, and that you still care about doing the right thing for mobile and the users we have on mobile. And for the past longer than 6 years, I would say about 10 years, I've been assembling what I like to think of as a data-informed view of how people use mobile devices. And the reason why I've been doing that is because I really want to better understand how to make products that work for that context, right? If you sort of understand what's happening with mobile and how people use it, then you can adapt what you make for that reality. And a simpler way of putting that is, what does mobile use actually look like so you can design effectively for it? And so that's what I want to talk about today. And along the way, what I'm going to do is also walk through a bunch of design considerations when creating these types of experiences that hopefully are pretty pragmatic and you can go put to use. So under this theme, let's talk about our mobile planet. Sorry. I just spend all day making those slides do that stuff. It's a lot of fun. Now watch this one, ready? Thank you. Yes, all right, goodbye. So this is our planet Earth, right? Third planet from the sun, third rock from the sun. And as far as we know, the only thing in the known universe that harbors what we call life, which is us, right? Now, how much life? That's a pretty good question. If you're counting human life on this planet, there's about 7.6 billion of us around the globe right now. Now, I should say, if you look at the World Bank's data set, the last time they actually collected this data was in 2016, when it was 7.4 billion. So this is an estimate, right? And I say this because I'm at Google. There's always some Googler in the audience that's like, technically it's 7.63 billion. 7.6 billion, pretty good. All right, so that's a lot of people on this rock that's spinning around our sun. Now, when you look at this number of 7.6 billion, there's some different ways of slicing it. And one of the ones that I think is important is really thinking about how much of these people are an addressable market, right? So when you make things, whether you make software or hardware or other kinds of products, how many people can you actually reach? And if you count an addressable market as adults, so I'm just going to, for the sake of simplicity, say people who are 14 plus. It's a pretty common definition out there. We're looking at about 5.6 billion of that 7.6 billion is an addressable market, right? People you can sell things to in a pretty systematic way. Now, of these 5.6 billion, a good number of them actually have mobile devices already. In fact, right now there's about 5 billion unique mobile subscribers. And when I say a mobile subscriber, that's somebody with a mobile plan and a number, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that mobile plan has data and they're hopping on the internet yet. It also doesn't mean that they have a very capable mobile device. Of this 5 billion number, where we stand today is roughly about 3.5 billion are on smartphones. Right? And smartphones kind of change the game for what you can do with your mobile device. Because with a smartphone, you generally have the ability to go and browse the full internet. You have the ability to run apps. You've got a better processor, all kinds of good things. Usually you have a better connection to the internet. So it makes that whole kind of pocket supercomputer thing connected to the internet all the time much more real than when you're on a feature phone in general. And I think it's worth looking at, and by the way, this is active smartphones right now, so the amount that are on the planet that are working. And note that I drew them in a little dashed line because it doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one mapping between people, right? You could have 2 active smartphones for whatever reason in your life that are on a data plan. How does that compare to the number of active PCs is a pretty common question people have. And by PC, I mean personal computer, desktop, laptop, basically the kinds of things that we use to go and do our jobs for those of us who are in the tech industry, right? And of those, there's about 1.3 billion active on the planet right now. If you really want to slice this down, a huge majority of those are Windows devices, about 1.2 billion. 110 million are Macs running OS X or Mac OS as they call it these days. And increasingly, a number of those are on Windows 10. Right now, there's about 700 million as of a week or two ago when Microsoft did their build conference. They said they were almost at 700 million, just a tiny bit to go. So it's probably approaching about 700 million right now. So that's not a small number by any stretch of the imagination. But unlike smartphones, the PC number really isn't growing that much right now. Right? We're not at a state where this number is increasing at the rate at which the 3.5 billion smartphones are growing. And you may say, well, how much are they growing? When you go from where we're at today, bless you, and you fast forward, maybe about, 5 years or so. So we're at 2018 right now. Let's say we'll go forward to about 2023, so about 5 years forward. Most projections, and there's several different ones out there, but the vast majority say we'll hit about 5 billion active smartphones by 2023. And what that roughly translates to is all these mobile subscriptions that are out there will turn over and become these pocket supercomputers. Right, and at this point, you can say, hey, we're reaching very close to the whole addressable market of the world, right, of all known intelligent life that we're aware of. Now, of course, if you are intelligent life, you say, hey, wait, but in 5 years, won't the population get bigger? And yes, the answer is it will. But it should grow to about 8 billion, depending on which projections you look at. United Nations says in 5 years. The US Census Bureau says it's going to take more like 7 years, but roughly similar types of growth. And even with this population growth, I think it's pretty clear to say that smartphones are really driving, and I'll use this phrase in quotes, planet scale reach and opportunity. I think that's a really interesting way of framing the space, right? Planet scale. We're able to, in real time, with the information and services that we put on the internet, reach the planet. It's a pretty big deal. Coming back to where we are today, let's dig a little bit deeper into what's happening in this 3.5 billion smartphone number. So I'll just sort of put this over here so we can look more concretely at that specific number. Right? So when we look at these 3.5 billion smartphones that we have out here, what kind of devices are we talking about? Well, roughly 25% of these active smartphones are running some version of Apple's mobile operating system, iOS. In their most recent 2018 earnings, Apple said there's about 1.3 billion active Apple devices. Remember, about 100 million Macs or so. 300 million iPads, and somewhere between 8 and 900 million iPhones. Right? The other major platform for smartphones is, of course, Android. Right? And Android has a much larger market share of active devices than iOS, roughly 75% or so. And the last time Google shared a public number was 2 billion active Android devices. That was in 2017. That number excludes how many of these Android devices are running in China, where there's about 550 million or so, 700 million active smartphones in China, 150 million are iOS. So that leaves roughly 550 million in China, and 10% of that 2 billion number is tablets. So if you kind of factor in growth, these Android devices in China, we're well past the 2 billion number now, a year later. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, hold on, this 25, 75% number, that's a little different than some of the numbers I've heard elsewhere. And I think this is a good time to point out that there's different numbers, right? There is active devices in use. That's sort of what I've been talking about today. And then there's a number you commonly hear reported on, which is shipments. And if you look at shipments, that is how many of these devices go out worldwide, you can see that the disparity is even higher. Right? Only 15% of worldwide smartphone shipments come from Apple, but 85% are on the Android side. So why is there a difference? I think primarily the difference stems from how long people keep their devices. As those of you who have an iPhone probably know, there is no such thing as an inexpensive iPhone, right? Android phones, on the other hand, come in a very wide range of prices, some even sub $100. So it's not surprising that on average, people keep their expensive devices longer. So there was a study done very recently on how long people actually keep iPhones. And the average that they kind of came to based on how many active devices and how many devices were sold was about 4.25 years. It's been a while since I've seen a public Android study, but the number cited before, a while ago, sorry, was a lot smaller. It was more like 2 years or so. So again, I should point out that Android study is like 4 years ago, so maybe this number has gone up. But in general, right, there is a difference here in how long people keep these devices as active based on the range of devices that are out there, most likely. So it is useful, however, I mentioned sort of the difference between active devices and shipments. It is useful to look at shipments, though, as these are the things that are continuing to increase how many active smartphones are around the world, right? And we also look at how many shipments are out there to know where things are growing, how much they're growing, stuff like that. If you look at sort of the biggest markets, if you will, for these devices right now, and you look at what penetration looks like across all of them, you can see in the United States, roughly 70% of the market already has a smartphone. Whereas someplace like India, it's only 22%. And China, 52%. When you factor in the population sizes of some of those countries, you can see we've still got a long way to grow here. Right? This is by no means at a saturation point. Hence, you see that 3.5 billion number going up to about 5 billion. Right? So lots of reasons why there's these differences between how saturated a market is, how accessible the networks are, how much devices cost, how much data costs, all kinds of things, whether or not they even have electricity. But the only thing to take away from this is there's a lot of headroom here. Right? We're not done yet. And penetration, smartphone penetration, doesn't really tell the complete story in any given market or region. I really like illustrating this difference because I think it highlights just how a different kind of market can adapt and account for mobile. So here, what I'm looking at is the largest online shopping day in the US, which is called Cyber Monday. I always joke, you have to say it that way. There's some marketing plant in the audience, will get you. They'll report you did not say it properly. So Cyber Monday in the US, about 10 years ago, the cumulative online one-day sales were about 600 million. It's not too shabby for one day of online buying, right? It's a lot of money. Trace that over about 10 years, and you can see that number jumped to almost 7 billion in one day. Now, clearly, people buying a lot more stuff online. If you could look at the largest one-day shopping day in China, however, it's Singles Day. It was sort of created around 2009, and you trace its trajectory. Last year, it did 25 billion in online sales in one day. So again, differences in markets, right? The US, a pretty mature market. China, less mature market. And remember sort of the smartphone saturation numbers, or penetration numbers. The other interesting fact here is only 33% of the sales were completed on mobile in the US on this biggest shopping day of the year. But in China, it's 90% of sales. So even though they only have 50% smartphone penetration, the US has something like 70%, you already see pretty big differences between this stuff, right? And these are differences in scale, but they're also differences in usage patterns. And it's very important when we think about this mobile planet, and we try to understand behaviors, we don't get caught up in our own, almost too small worldview, if you will. Just because certain things are happening in one country or region doesn't mean that's the way things look around the planet. And there may even be larger opportunities out there that we tend not to see. But anyway, what you can take from this is holiday shopping days in China dwarf those in the US, both in terms of scale and mobile purchases. Now, pretty much everywhere you look, though, you can see the impact of the growth of smartphones on our planet, right? And what this is doing is it's really driving very large shifts towards digital. In the United States, which is a market I sort of know better than many others, if you look at retail shopping, and you follow the trajectory back from 1992 to the end of the beginning of last year, if you will, you can see that not too long ago, online retail took over what used to be sort of the bedrock of where people bought in the US, which is these department stores, right? You go to the department store to buy things. Now, online, not only has it overtaken it, it's never looked back, and poor department stores are not looking too good. Another kind of trend in industry in the US, if you look in terms of advertising, for a long time, it was this kind of milestone. When will internet advertising surpass TV advertising, which is a huge industry in the US, right? Lots and lots of people buy TV advertising. It creates lots of money, and it's a big deal. And literally, just in 2017, last year, was the first time that in the US, internet advertising passed TV advertising. It reached a total of $88 billion, as you can see here at the end of 2017. So another industry that's sort of been affected by this transition. If you look at other places like the music industry, for example, in the US, and few industries, I think, can really show the impact of smartphone capabilities, which I will kind of characterize as always on, always connected, always with you, right? These pocket supercomputers connected to the cloud and all the good things the internet has to offer. The music industry really shows what can happen with those types of devices. Because if you trace the trajectory between physical media, CDs, those sorts of things, and how much money the music industry in the US makes from those versus how much they make for streaming, you can really see that line just shooting aggressively to the top. Bottom line, lots of these transitions are happening across industries in the US, and honestly, I have a whole sort of smorgasbord of these things at this point. And what's interesting about this is it's across a wide range of businesses, and in most cases, the digital lines haven't just crossed the previous lines, they're accelerating. Right? So we sort of looked at retail shopping between online and department stores in the US. US consumer spending on technology has now passed clothing. People are just walking around naked with their phones all day. This one's perhaps not surprising, but landline phones versus only cell phones. People don't even put phones in their houses anymore. And it's not just the US. Well, I say I have a lot of US examples. Here's the UK. Digital video has passed physical video in terms of revenue. And there's global changes as well. If you look at global time spent across the whole planet, the amount of time people spend on the internet is just about to pass the amount of time people spend watching TV. I showed sort of the US music industry chart. Here's the global music revenue chart showing the exact same thing. The digital music has now passed physical music. Okay? And I can kind of keep going and going with these types of lines crossing, but pretty clear what's happening here, right? If you have a business, chances are your business is affected by this, regardless of what that business is. Right? With these 3.5 billion active smartphones on our planet, clearly mobile and these two major platforms, right, is not only a growing planet scale opportunity, but it's making these whole things become digital. Kind of shifting the dynamics, shifting the players, and also shifting people's expectations of how these things work. How does the process of getting, listening to, and owning music work? Is being changed. How does the process of finding things to purchase, buying them, using them, and all that changing as well? And it's not just these transitions. Again, it's the fact that this acceleration continues to happen. If you picture that 3.5 billion number going to 5 billion over the next 5 years or so, you can see what those lines are going to continue doing. Right? So this is kind of my first part about like what does mobile use actually look like so you can design for it. The first one is it's really freaking big. It's really, really big stuff. So what else do we know about our mobile planet? When you think about this number, the next thing you might want to ask, well, what's happening with these 3.5 billion smartphones? How are people using them? And to start answering that question, kind of what I want to do is look at how much time do people spend on these things. And to do that, we'll look at the US, where I actually have a whole bunch of different data sources so we can really get a clear picture. What we see is from most analytics firms, whether it's ComScore or Nielsen or eMarket or what have you, they all are roughly reporting between 2 and 3 hours per day spent on smartphones. Right? One's at 3.3, one's at 2.3. But if you average these things out, what you're roughly looking at is 3 hours spent per day on these devices. Some of you, that time is ticking right now as you take a picture of the slide. Right? 3 hours per day. Now, some regions, it's actually a little bit higher than 3 hours per day. Some regions, it's a little bit lower than 3 hours per day. But 3 hours per day is a pretty good baseline for looking at this. And you think, 3 hours, right? That's a lot of time out of a day, isn't it? Where is this time coming from, right? Out of our regular day, where did these 3 hours emerge from? And to answer this question, I'm going to go back to 7 years or so ago here, looking at this eMarketer data of time spent per day by people. And as you go from 2011 up to where we're at today, you can see two things. Number one, mobile time spent has pretty strongly surged, right? From like 46 minutes a day to they have 3.2 or so hours per day. But at the same time, what's perhaps most interesting is the rest of the stuff hasn't really gone down that much. I mean, TV went from 4.5 hours to about 4 hours. Radio went from, 1 hour and 34 minutes to 1 hour and 25 minutes. So it hasn't really dropped that much. These other forms of media haven't fallen off a cliff as mobile has surged. If you flip and look over at Nielsen's data, you see a very similar story, right? When we go back 3 years with Nielsen, you can see smartphone, again, really, really grow. They have it at 2-something hours. But once again, the other forms of media, we went from maybe 5 hours of TV to 4 hours and 20 minutes worth of TV. And so what I take away from this is, since there's this big jump in mobile, but TV and radio time still persists, most of this mobile time spent has actually been additive. Right? It's added to our screen time. It's the amount of time we spend on media every day. And I think this is by virtue of it always being with you, always being on, it just creates more screen time in our lives. There's more opportunities for us to fire up one of these devices. Like here, you're not watching TV, are you? Well, maybe you are. But you can actually pull out the device. Now, that's not to say mobile isn't taking time away from other forms of media. Right? For instance, if we again go back about 8 years or so and we trace radio listening on mobile, which is this light blue line here, you can see that radio listening is gradually transitioning to mobile. And you can even see TV viewing is gradually taking some time away from these other forms of media. Right? But this process is way slower than the overall growth of time spent on mobile. And you can infer what you want from about people from this, but I would basically say, like, look, old habits die hard, right? Takes a while for people to stop doing things like watching TV. And even in markets that have high smartphone penetration, remember we looked at the US where there's something like 70% smartphone penetration in use. Here you can see that over time, right, smartphones are gradually taking more time away from other forms of connected devices, desktops, and even tablets. Right? It's not this huge chunk, but like gradually it's getting bigger and bigger. And so the takeaway from all of this is not only is the amount of active smartphones on our planet growing, so is time spent on them. Right? People are doing more and more on these devices as time goes on. So, given how much time 3 hours is, it's a lot of time out of the day, it does make sense to ask, well, what the heck are people doing for so long on these devices? How are they doing 3 hours per day? And to answer that, for starters, we can kind of look at, well, what sorts of things do they fire up on these mobile devices? And by and large, what they're doing is spending a lot of time inside of mobile apps. Right? About 169 minutes of those 3 hours or so are spent inside of mobile apps, much more so than the amount of time they're spending inside of mobile browsers. In fact, the time spent within mobile apps kind of dwarfs the amount of time people spend inside of mobile browsers, right? And so it's no wonder there's a ton of investment and lots of people trying to seize this opportunity of native mobile apps. If you look today and you see just how many of these darn things people have made and pushed into the App Store, there's 2.8 billion apps in Google Play Store and 2.2 billion in the Apple App Store. That's a hell of a lot of mobile apps, right? And there is a big active audience for these apps. As people make these, people get them. So every month, there's 2 smartphone apps downloaded for every human being on planet Earth. That people are getting a lot of these things and putting them on their devices, right? Or maybe a simpler way of putting this is there's lots of apps out there, both in app stores and on people's phones. But being available, that is, being in an app store and being downloaded, aka being on somebody's phone, doesn't necessarily mean being used. Because people, despite having a lot of apps on their phone, generally use maybe half to a third of them every month. All right? So of those apps that they've got on their phones, they're only using half to a third of them. And so it probably bears repeating, though most of you know this, downloads do not equal usage. So like, I've got 5 million downloads. Hopefully all of you by now know that's not necessarily the best metric to track. And how is it that there's so many apps on people's phones that aren't being used? Well, if you look a little bit deeper, most of them don't make it past first use. A large chunk don't make it past first use. 25% get dropped right after first use. Only about 30% get opened more than 11 times. And if you look at the average losses people face after 3 days or after 90 days, it's pretty harsh, right? So rapid loss of users. And to kind of make things even more brutal, long-term, the situation gets worse, right? The mobile app retention that you have after a month, after 6 months, after a year, just kind of keeps getting worse. And so all this work designing and building a mobile app and acquiring the downloads, it feels like, ouch. There's a lot of work just to be kind of bleeding these users. So I've seen many, many companies and services and products in this kind of state, and they all basically jump to 2 conclusions to fix the problem. 2 very common ways that they say, oh, you know, we got to improve retention. We got to keep more people in our natives apps. We're losing these people, but it's such a huge opportunity. We got to take advantage of it. So what do they turn to? Any ideas? Notifications, good one. Anybody know what the other one is? Emails, okay. I'm going to count that on notifications, but notifications, and the other one everybody turns to is onboarding. Now, if we just get people onboarded better, then they'll understand the value of our app and stick around. So So lots of onboarding redesign projects and lots of notifications projects going on. And all of you, of course, know what notifications are, right? Notifications are those messages that pop up on a mobile device, like this set of notifications from Apple News telling me that there's news. Very useful, right? See what you've been missing. Like, they're totally running tests here, right? See what you've been missing. Maybe if we say, see all the news you've been missing, then let's try that one. Oh, is that 0.2% better click-through rate? Okay. But in all seriousness, why do people care about push notifications? They care about push notifications because, frankly, if you remind people you exist, then the chances increase that they remember that you exist. If you never remind them that you exist, chances are they could forget about you. And so there's lots of data out there that will show, right, that without push, your retention looks a lot worse than if you have some kind of push notifications. And so it's no wonder that people, again, experiment with this, try doing a whole bunch of different push notifications things. And there's a lot to talk about this, about how to do this well, how not to do this well. It could end up being all that we talk about. So instead, rather than spending the whole day talking about notifications, I'm going to shift to the other common solution for retention issues, which is app onboarding. Right? There's countless onboarding projects that I see. People are always redesigning onboarding when they figure out that they have a leaky funnel, people dropping out of their mobile experiences. And so what is onboarding? Just to level set, you've all seen these kinds of things, right? For example, this is the photo sharing app Flickr, which when you open the app, it says, get started, and tells you, if you flick across, you can share and connect. You can have stunning photos made easily, have all your pictures in one place. All you need to do for all that is get started. All right, pretty typical example. It just walks you through these features or benefits. And seeing this, you might rightfully agree that these screens did very little to help you both understand what the heck this thing is, and probably even less to encourage you to use it, right? Is anybody super compelled to download this app right now? So if this onboarding experience is not so great, why do so many mobile apps kick off their first-time experiences this way? Well, A, everybody just copies what everybody else is doing. That's answer number one. Right? That's how most projects start out. It's like, oh, they did this. We should do that. Let's do that. Do you have any idea why we're doing this? No, but let's do it. We have to do it. That's one reason. But the other reason is you actually talk to human beings who use your products. You see something. So for this, I'm going to walk through my favorite set of onboarding studies. This is from Intuit, when they were making a small business app for paying your workers and managing your taxes. And it's a case study that's featured in Teresa Neal's great little mobile patterns book. But while the designs are a little old school and don't hold up, the actual insights, I would say the takeaways certainly do hold up. And so what the team at Intuit found was when they talked to people and they showed them this new app, and they just sort of plopped people into the app, right? They said, here you go. What they heard people say, and what you will hear if you just drop people into something, is like, well, I don't really know what to do here. I feel kind of lost. Not sure what's going on. Right? Very common reaction. You just pop people into here, and they don't necessarily have the confidence or the understanding of what to go doing. Now, part of this may be an artifact of how we do usability testing, because we very rarely say, okay, pretend you heard about this app from your friends, and then you searched for it, and then you clicked the link, and then you just sort of drop them in. But regardless, this is kind of what you'll hear. And so, well, what's a poor mobile design team to do? Of course, the first thing they turn to is, well, we got to tell them what they can do here, right? People are telling us they're lost, they don't know what to do, so let's tell them what they can do. So they turn to these guided tours, tutorials, intro screens, and they try to explain, well, what can you do inside of our app? How does smart payroll work? You enter these workers hours and wages. We'll do the math. You pay. Right? Explains all this stuff first. So like many, many other teams, this is what the Intuit team did. And when they tested this version, they basically observed two things very consistently. Number one, nobody read any of it. And number two, they were desperately trying to figure out how they could skip it. Can I just get this thing out of here, right? And at this point, you're like, what the heck, human beings? You tell me you're lost, you don't know what to do. I give you a thing that tries to tell you what to do so you're not lost, and you immediately want to skip it. You don't even read it. Right? Like, throw me a bone here. It's a typical, design you just can't win situation. So what did they do? Well, they thought, like many other teams thought, maybe we're just not showing the help people need in the right way. Maybe it works better if we put it in context, right? So what if instead of this intro tour, we just sort of call things out on the app and tell you what to do? And by the way, since everybody uses cute little characters, let's just add this robot for the hell of it. And the robot will tell you what to do, right? Enter wages. It's awesome. And of course, you've seen these kinds of tutorials and design things before. They're all over the place, right? These are excellent examples of such things. So the folks at Intuit aren't the only ones that thought maybe this overlaid set of instructions would work better than this upfront tutorial. Now, thankfully, the Intuit team also went ahead and tested these designs. And when they did so, well, what did they hear? Well, people generally responded with something that sounded like, please make this stop. Comments included, I just want to make this get out of my way. All right, so now what? Right? People are lost, they don't know what to do, they need help. You try and give them a tutorial, they don't read it. You give them a cute little robot that shows them things, and they want to kill it. What gives? Well, they decided to do something different. And they tried to do something a lot simpler. They simply added one call out, which basically was focused on a good first step. Since the whole purpose, the core of the app is to go and pay your employees. The core action of the app, the primary action, is to add some workers so you can start paying them. Nothing else works in the app unless you have some people that you can pay, right? And so they called this out. And when they did this, people coming to the app now all of a sudden felt like they had a pretty good sense of what they should do. Right? They had a sense of what was available, and they had a clear first step. And so there was no intro tour needed, none of these kinds of things, because they matched the first-time experience to the purpose and the process of getting value out of the app. Let's look at a couple more examples to see what we can take away from this. So Vevo is is a music video service that, of course, has an intro tour, because everybody has an intro tour, right? And what they did is they actually looked at people using this tour through a combination of user tests and analytics, and they found a similar thing to what the Intuit folks saw, which is everybody was just swiping through this without reading any of the copy. So they thought to themselves, okay, well, there's a bit of an insight. What if we just skip all this? Is the amount of people who are going to register for the site, which is what they ultimately wanted because they wanted to have them have playlists, is it going to be higher if they get rid of that whole tour? So they ran an experiment, 160,000 participants, and what they learned is the total number of people who went into the app increased. The tour did nothing because of the people that made it in, their engagement and retention metrics were the exact same, right? They were getting no benefit from that tour. They weren't collecting any of that information and using it later. And the number of people that ultimately kind of skipped or didn't skip this stuff from the beginning didn't change either. But what they did get is a lot more successful logins and completed sign-ins. So getting rid of that tour was actually a good thing. But while Vevo got rid of their tour, they actually left in some other things. They left in the sign-in and registration form, right? They dropped that middle section, but they left the sign up. And of course they did. That's what you do on the internet, right? Usernames and passwords are practically an institution on the internet. How can you possibly make something without usernames and passwords? So of course you have to have a sign-in screen. Hotel Tonight, which is this example, decided to challenge that because they, like Vivo, were I got to really figure out how to pronounce that. Anybody know? Vivo? Okay, cool. Vivo. I like you people. So Hotel Tonight decided to challenge that because, like Vivo, they were watching users. By the way, do you notice a pattern here? They're actually watching human beings use their stuff. And by doing so, they find things. They're like, everybody skips that. Right? And what Hotel Tonight realized was when they were watching people, people were really confused by accounts. They're like, why do I want an account? I'm just trying to get this hotel room for tonight. Their mental model was this notion of e-commerce, where they expected something like guest checkout, not like a social networking app where they create a profile and sign up and make this account, right? So they were kind of confused as to why they had to do this to get a hotel room. And so what they ended up doing is they dropped the whole sign-up thing, and they later asked you to be able to create something, and they saw a big boost from this as well. And what I really like from this is this quote that Amanda Richardson, who shared this example at Hotel Tonight, laid out, which is she has this paradigm: ruthlessly edit. Even when you have the slimmest funnel, cut again. Right? She really calls for culling things down to the absolute least amount necessary. And by the way, it's pretty notable that this is coming from a company like Hotel Tonight, because the CEO of Hotel Tonight actually considers their funnel to be a competitive advantage. Right? He's many times pointed out that booking a hotel is only 3 taps and 1 swipe. This is a big deal for us. We're so much better, and we actually do better because of this. And if you compare kind of the booking flow to competitors, Hotels Tonight is 4 taps and a swipe, takes about 8 seconds. Something like Priceline, to do the same act, takes 52 taps and 102 seconds, a little bit more. Right. Hotels.com is 40 taps, 109 seconds, also a little bit more. So he's maybe right to be a bit bullish, right? Like, nobody else is going to work as hard as we do. And even though they work so damn hard and they're already this good, they still have this mentality of ruthlessly editing, right? What else? What other kind of precious darlings do we have that are actually getting in the way? Maybe sign up is actually getting in the way. What can we do here, right? And so if Hotel Tonight can trim down their funnel, to me, that's pretty telling that many other companies still have a much longer way to go. Right? Because like I say, they're pretty far out there compared to where much of their competition is. And I would argue many people aren't even measuring things like this or thinking about it. Right? It's not on their minds. You can see similar principles to what we've been getting toward here at work in the evolution of several Google products as well. So if you look at Google Photos, the Google Photos onboarding flow for Android used to look something like this. We'd fire up a little spinning Photos logo, then of course we'd have the obligatory Get Started page, right? Get started. Then there was a cue to help back up your photos and videos, and then there was an animated tutorial that taught you some things, like that you can pinch to zoom, and you can press and hold to select photos, so it kind of taught you about some of the experiences. And so you had this introduction to the Android app. Now, following a large number of tests where they gradually sort of tested pieces one by one, what they ended up with was getting rid of that, getting rid of that, getting rid of that, and getting rid of that. And then that middle screen actually got redesigned to look like this. So the whole flow kicked down to just a half-screen little dialogue from the bottom. And I think it's worth calling out that in order to get value out of Google Photos, what Google Photos does is it backups your photos, right? And then it automatically allows you to search for them because it recognizes the images, places, and things in them. You don't have to tag anything. And then it'll make awesome photos for you, like create panoramas on the fly, make movies for you, give you stylized photos. It can't do any of that unless you start backing up your photos. So basically, the majority of the service just does not work until you turn on auto backup. So what should the onboarding process be? Getting you to turn on auto backup, right? This is kind of the core value. We're going to host all your photos for you. And if you use the high-res version for free, back them all up, make them searchable, what have you. And there's a bunch of things done to kind of encourage this. You can now see your photos behind this little dialogue. It has the text really thought through. It shows you clearly what you're going to do, and there's just one big button that says done. Now, in order to actually implement a strategy like this, right, you have to actually know what your core value is. Right? I think this is a great illustration of the principle of getting the product value as fast as possible. And by the way, it's as fast as possible, but not faster. And the idea is that you have to ask people for the minimum amount of information you need to get them the most valuable experience. In the case of Google Photos, that's turning on auto backup. Where I see most companies struggling with implementing stuff like this is they don't know what their core value / action is. Well, we kind of do a little bit of this, and sometimes we do that. Oh, and some people use this for this, but some people like that, so. Makes it real hard to do this. You can see a similar approach in Google Maps on iOS. Before, there was a welcome, and there was a sign-in screen, right? Now, there's just a map, and it says, OK, you're signed in. What's the whole purpose of Google Maps? Maps, 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 maps. Right? And truthfully, there's actually one step before this. Before you do this, there's a little thing that pops up. Allow Google Maps to access your location. Clearly spelled out to get navigation, real-time traffic, transit updates, and see places near you. The core value of the app. What you get is navigation, real-time traffic, transit updates, places near you. In order to get this value, you have to give them the location. And like photos with auto backup, Maps just doesn't work as well unless it knows where you are, right? So it's the same principle that I talked about earlier. It's not get rid of everything in onboarding and sign up. It's get rid of everything getting in the way of getting to product value. Right? All the stuff that's not helping people get directly to product value should go out the door. And if we come back to the work the Intuit team was doing, we can now see that where they ended up is actually more of the same thing. This initial tip, right, it was all about getting the core value of the app. Remember, it's a payroll app. It doesn't work unless you have people to pay. Doesn't matter what the little robot tells you, right? You can't manage an employee payroll without having some employees. And so that's kind of where they landed. Got rid of everything except this core focus. And by the way, there's an updated design for this, which made it kind of more like the real app. So we move away from that earlier sort of design style. Speaking of design style, though, there is one more thing here that's worth discussing, and that's the way this is presented. The way this first run initial experience shows up. And when I say presented, what I'm really talking about here is the visual design. And so looking at this for a second, in particular, important actions that are a core part of getting to the value purpose of an application really need to feel like part of the application, not like a bolt-on or a one-off sort of feature. And you can see the difference when you look at these two examples. Here we have this sort of tooltip overlay, whereas here we have something that's much more integrated into the user interface. Right? It's part of the screen. It looks like the rest of the screen is the same fonts. It sort of calls out, hey, here's where you go and create a radio station. So you overlay integrated UI, and believe it or not, you'll actually see a difference, an impact between these two solutions, right, depending on which of these kind of two approaches you go with. And the difference stems from the fact that many people treat overlays as like a distraction or a tangent instead of as something aligned with their core task. And you've all probably done this. How many times when you see something pop up on the screen, your first instinct is get rid of it, right? That's just kind of the first thing we try. As Lisa points out, when people are task-focused, they're trying to get something done, right? They quickly dismiss or ignore these overlays and assume it's not part of this core flow they're going through, right? Something that's telling them to do something else, like sign up for our mailing list. And by the way, it's our own damn fault because we've abused these things so badly. Right? You go to a web page, it's like, give us your email address, but I want to buy a... No. Tanner, who worked at Facebook for a long time, calls out some of these same things, but he points out that in many cases, these dismissals may even be accidental. Right? That is, people just get rid of dialogue things by instinct. It's like an animal instinct for us. Whereas before, it was like saber-toothed tiger. Now it's like dialogue window. Your brain doesn't even think. It just sort of get rid of them. And in cases where these dialogues actually have useful information, once you get rid of them, there's no way to get them back. And so it's like a double disservice. Not only do these things get ignored, but they also can't help you, which is the whole point of them, once you get rid of them. And at the heart of this problem is this desire amongst people who design software that is to make things pop. Have you ever heard this, right? Oh, that feature is not discoverable enough. We need to make it pop more. Right? If only we'd make it pop, then people would know about it. And so what we're thinking to ourselves is like, this information is important. It needs to look that way. It needs to look important. And so what we do is we apply a lot of like visual contrast and differences to make it really stick out, make it look different from the rest of the UI, right? Make it pop. And the issue comes in is that we're actually good at that. We're successful. When we want to make something pop, we can make it really pop. We can make it really stick out. We make it stick out so much that it looks so different that it looks out of place. In this example from Red Laser, you can see that red kind of buttony thing with the rounded edge that's popping up from the top. And he basically says, hey, we wanted people to hit the scan button a lot, so we made it huge, we made it a different color, and everybody just ignored it. He was like, what the heck is that? I don't know. I'm just going to, what is that? And so in subsequent redesigns, they toned down the shape, added a label to make it look more like the real thing. But you know what makes it look most like the real thing? Making it look like the real thing. Right, so this make it pop and make it different thing is dangerous because if you actually do it right, you end up with the opposite effect of what you wanted. You make something stand out so much that it doesn't look like it belongs. And you could see a similar transition if you follow the course of Instagram redesigns over the years, right? In the very first version of Instagram, there's this big share button. It actually kind of fit in many ways, but then they made it a big blue button, then they kind of toned it down a little. And now, if you look at where they're at, it's very much an integrated part of the user interface. Now, I suspect Instagram didn't have as many problems over the years as Red Laser maybe said, because the contrast isn't as strong, right? It looks more like it. But you can gradually see them making these things more and more like part of the core UI. And the lesson to take away from this stuff, right, is the basic principle is when elements feel foreign to a product UI, they are ignored, usually, or at best, accidentally, prematurely dismissed. Right? So foreign to app UI, it's kind of like a virus you want to kill, get rid of it. When it's integrated with the UI, right, when it feels like part of it, they're much more effective. And I was sort of thinking to myself, a lot of times we talk about consistency, make things consistent. And I always rally against the notion of consistency for consistency's sake. Like, why do we actually want to make things consistent? And in this case, it's not consistency for consistency's sake, it's consistency for efficiency's sake, right? This is why a cohesive design system matters, so that things that are alike feel alike, and you can attribute your learned behavior of what that is. Oh, these are the main actions. Oh, that looks like a main action. It's a main action. Right? You can apply the meaning that you've taken from their elements to what else is on the screen. So it's a pretty good argument for consistency when you think about it as being there to drive efficiency. Now, let's pull together what we've looked at for app onboarding. So I sort of told you, even if we only talk about app onboarding and not push notifications, got a lot to talk about here. And I want to pull this app onboarding stuff into a quick set of principles. I really like the way Casey Winters, who was a growth advisor over at Greylock Ventures, he used to lead growth at Pinterest. He was one of the first marketers at Grubhub. So he's seen a lot of this stuff. And his organization structure really resonated with me, so I'm just going to use his structure. So the first one here is a very simple principle, but usually poorly applied. Get to product value as fast as possible, right? And in the examples that he used, it's very similar to what we looked at. Grubhub, which is a delivery service that brings food to you from places around you, you can't bring you food unless it knows where you are. It can't tell you where it can get you food from unless it knows where you are. So the not any faster is it needs your address. Right? Pinterest, on the other hand, needs to kind of know what topics you're interested in, craft beer, astronomy, whatever. So you can't get through onboarding unless you give it some topics. That's the but not faster part of Pinterest, right? The minimum amount of information you need to get to a valuable experience. And the reason why Pinterest needs to know what topics you care about so it can show you a feed of ideas on those topics. So that's kind of principle one. Second, and this one is much harder to do, get rid of everything that does not lead to product value. And when I say everything, I'm going to come back to Amanda from Hotel Tonight's quote, ruthlessly edit. It can be surprising what kind of edits matter. And the reason why it can be surprising is because a lot of times we don't even put it on the list. Who puts sign up and accounts on the list? Right? No, you don't have to have that. If you don't have any sacred cows, you can challenge your assumptions. At Pinterest, just to show you how far they went with this, this is the regular Pinterest feed, right? It shows the pictures, it gives you comments, tells you who posted them, gives you some social signals. When you first come into the app, all of that's gone. It's edited, right? So they removed the descriptions underneath pins as well as who pinned the item because the core product value had to do with finding images you like. And removing descriptions, removing social attribution allowed new users to see more images. So they're more likely to find an image that they liked. And this is a pretty big step, right? Going from kind of like, this is our feed. Oh, people post this. That's what we do. No, get rid of all of that. You really have to understand the core value and purpose to do things like this. But they're also, I would argue, kind of bolder moves that most people don't even put on the table. And of course, none of this means not teaching people about your product, right? I'm by no means saying you shouldn't educate people on how to use things. It's silly to assume everybody's going to just figure this stuff out. I mean, for God's sake, we have signs on how to use doors, right? And you think, of course people know how to use doors. So it's okay to have help. Help is good and actually frequently allows people to understand how to get value out of a product in ways that create long-term engagement. And while you should always be striving for a design that is quote unquote obvious and doesn't need education, don't be afraid to use it when you do. But when you do, right, make sure that it integrates well with the UI. So in this example for Pinterest, they found one of the things that helped a lot was to make these call-outs that, hey, you can look at these more, you can actually scroll up. But they made it feel like part of the product experience. And doing it that way. And just for kicks and giggles, I think it's useful just to see kind of the difference between educating in context and not. This is a web-based product from Zurb that allows you to annotate screenshots. So you sort of put in a screenshot, you hit the button, and it takes a second for them to capture the screenshot. While they are capturing the screenshot, they actually give you a little overview of some of the things that you can do and some of the gestures that are available to you. Then when the screenshot loads, right, let's say we want to sort of scroll down here and mark it up. Whoops. Does anybody know what happened? Why did I just leave a big fat mark on the screen? Anyone know? Brush tool. You know what? You guys weren't reading the instructions. Look, remember this? Scribble with one finger, tap and hold to comment, and you scroll with 2 fingers. How could you miss that? It's clearly right there. All of you, nobody saw it? How about this? When you try to do that as your first gesture, maybe that's a good time to tell you, hey, you have to use 2 fingers to scroll. Maybe you want to undo that line that you just drew all over your picture. All right, it's an example of teaching in the moment. Right? Finding that opportunity where it's actually a good time to introduce help, as opposed to trying to saddle it all up front. Now, since we talked quite a while about app onboarding, I do believe this is a super important topic, and done right, it can have huge payoffs. Right? Of all the things that are out there that are available to help you grow retention and get people to understand the value of your product, this is one of the key areas that's worth investing your time, as hopefully you saw. So it's worth sort of summarizing what we talked about here, right? Product value, get rid of everything that's not part of it, this whole ruthlessly edit, and then teaching in the moment, trying to use integrated UI to get there goes a long way. So let's leave onboarding for a minute and come back to what we were talking about earlier. And I just feel I would be really remiss if I didn't address this issue about the web here, right? We saw that 3 hours per day are mostly concentrated in mobile apps and not on the web. And this is true, but we need to expand on things a little bit so that you don't walk away and think, oh, Luke said the web's not important. I don't want you to walk away with that. And the reason why I want to talk about this specifically is a lot of people think their job when they think about mobile strategy is to decide between, do we make a native app or do we make a mobile website? Right? Let me pick between the two. And I hear this over and over again, so I always like to remind us of the reality here. While it's true, the bulk of those 3 hours go to mobile apps, right? When we look at what's really happening there, we see that 50% of that goes to one app. Whatever somebody's most used app is on the phone. Over half that time, this guy's his Facebook, he loves it. He just calls it Facebook. You didn't call it out that loud, but that's cool. Half the time gets spent in your most used app. When you look at the top 5 apps, they capture 80% of time almost. Extend that out to the top 10 apps, and you're looking at 90% of the time, 96% of the time even, that people spend in native apps, right? Extend that out to all the other apps that get used, and there's only like 7 minutes left, which makes the web look pretty darn good, right? Not so bad anymore, is it? Sure, it looked bad there. It looks a little better here, a lot better here, much less shabby. Right? And the web has another advantage. It has a unique advantage here in that it's actually much easier to get large audiences on the web due to things like links, due to things like search. Right? There's a lot of mechanisms on the internet that help people get to web pages and websites. You can share those links via things like email, messaging, and the like. Right? So while time spent and activity within mobile websites is lower, audience size and the ability to grow your user base is much higher. And the simple way I've been describing this for a long time now is if you kind of contrast this, right? It's easier to build large audiences on the web, but people spend more time inside of native apps. This is a difference of reach and rich. And I'll just make one more point on this and move on, but I do think it's worth calling out, is while there's efforts on both sides to try and make the web richer and mobile apps have better reach. This is currently where things still excel, right? And generally, when you pick up a tool, you want to use it what it's best for. While you could use a hammer to make pancakes, you probably shouldn't. Right? Use it to hammer in a nail. And so we saw this contrast vividly when we did our last startup. And what we basically saw is when we reached unique users, right, we were able to reach a ton of new users on the web. But when we looked at how active those users were, despite reaching that many more people, look at the volume of stuff that small amount of people did on the entire platform, right? So native users, much more engaged, spend more time. So again, we can summarize this distinction as native apps are good at reach, web are good at reach, and it's not versus. It actually makes sense to do both, right? Both are strategically important. I'm going to talk about that more later, but you get the idea. OK, aside over. Let's continue to answer this question of what does mobile use actually look like so you can design for it effectively. We saw that there's these 3.5 billion active smartphones. They're still growing, right? There's 2 major platforms. They're shifting huge industries. Not only are there a lot of these devices, but they're very active as well, 3 hours per day on average. Those 3 hours are mostly additive. They happen within native apps where retaining people is hard. So things like onboarding can help a lot. And by the way, the web can also help you get more people in where if you can effectively onboard them, you can retain them. See kind of the process here? Right? Get people in, onboard them effectively, they stick around, good things happen. And by the way, this is why there's so much chatter in this event about PWAs, because you can really think about how they fit into this structure. I think you'll be hearing even more about those today. All right, coming back to our mobile planet for a second. And what I want to do is look at these 3 hours of use for a second. We know what happens in native apps, but what do these sessions actually look like? Like, how often are they happening? Apple released some numbers not that long ago where they said, look, people are unlocking their phones about 80 times a day. Android, if you look at different studies there, a pretty recent one pegged that number at about 76 times on average. I'm just going to use 80 times per day because it makes my math easier, and I'm not very good at math. So 3 hours spent per day across about 80 times per use. All right, you say 80 times, what does that mean? Sometimes these numbers don't really mean too many things to us. So let's try and make this more humane. Let's put this into a human context. How long do people sleep? 8 hours, good guess. Turns out, across the world, it varies a little bit. In the US, people sleep 8.8 hours, lazy. If you look, they sleep more in France, by the way. But if you look at the average across the planet, it's about 8.3 hours a night, right? So that leaves 16 hours of waking time per day for most people. If you have 16 hours of waking time per day, and you're on your phone 80 times per day, that means for every 12 minutes you are awake, there's a phone unlock. That's not like every 12 minutes, but per every 12 waking minutes, you are on your mobile device. That's a lot, right? And given this frequency, it's probably not much a surprise that most of these sessions are quite short. More than half of them are less than 30 seconds. And if you look within any particular app, 40% of a session in any app, sessions in any app are less than 15 seconds. Right? So really short amount of time in these devices. And throughout this conference, and probably any time Google has talked to you about mobile, they stress this thing like, hey, speed's really important, right? Have you heard this? And like, yeah, whatever, same thing again. But like, if you look at what people dislike about browsing on the web, the number one thing they dislike is waiting for slow pages. You've probably seen charts like this. There's a bunch of them, right? People they prefer to encounter an unplayable video a lot more than waiting for a slow web page to load. And unplayable videos are pretty bad, aren't they? Look at how much worse it is to wait for something. And like, why? Why do we keep stressing this over and over again? I hope this context I've been walking through helps you understand this. If you're on something for 3 hours a day, every day, 80 times a day, and in short, less than 30-second sessions, when there's a delay, it's going to be noticeable because you only got like 15 seconds in that app. And it's going to be noticeable a lot of times, right? 80 times a day. That's why we care so much. People get super pissed off about this. Here's another study. This is the one I love the most. I've shown this a few times. But what this study did, this is Ericsson, not too long ago, they measured what causes stress. And what they found is it's pretty stressful to wait in line at a retail store. Kind of sucks. Watching one of those dramatic TV shows, about the relationships and the people, and I don't know what they do. It's pretty stressful. Standing at the edge of a virtual cliff. VR is a thing, I guess. Pretty stressful. Watching a horror movie, which is designed to stress you out and should be stressful, pretty stressful. What's more stressful than watching a horror movie? Experiencing mobile delays. And we're not even in the business of stressing people out like horror movies are, right? There's people paid to make this stressful, and we're doing a better job. So if you're looking for a career change, I have a suggestion for you. What's more stressful than mobile delays? Solving math problems. Now, again, this is a great example, I think, of why understanding this broader context of mobile use on the planet is important, right? If you see these real behaviors, you can prioritize where to invest. 80 times a day, less than 30 seconds, right? 3 hours a day. Why you should really put a lot of money and time into making things fast. And I know we keep talking about it, like blah, 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 Google, but like this is why it matters, right? Hopefully this gives you some explanation. And it matters so much that not only do we apply technical solutions to make things fast, but we apply a lot of design solutions to make things feel fast, to sort of fake people out, right? Because mobile networks are there's only so much you can do to a certain point. Like you're in a crappy network connection, your phone's slow, whatever. There's only so much we can do. So we try to do a lot with product design too, to account for this and tackle it from both sides. That's how much it matters. And because mobile delays are such a big deal, lots of apps will tell people when they need to wait for things to load, right? You're going to probably wait because it's mobile. And so here, we'll give you a little progress indicator, let you know it's waiting. Now, on the surface, this seems like a good idea, right? Which is, hey, there's going to be a delay. We'll let you know, hey, we're working on it. Coming soon. And when we added this to our app, this is the Polar app, when we put this little spinner on, we thought we were doing people a service by letting them know things are happening. And all of a sudden, the amount of complaints we got about the app being slow just spiked, jumped up. And we're like, what the hell happened? Did we break something? Did we make it slower? We checked. No, it's just as fast as it was before. But what happened? Basically, we told people we were slow because we showed this progress indicator, right? We're like, wait. Oh, it's slow. I have to wait. It's the classic watched pot never boils. So what we did instead is we implemented this solution that I call skeleton screens, which is the idea of gradually loading content into a set of containers. And with this approach, which I'll illustrate here, right, you sort of load the page up with a little bit of a structure, and then you start gradually loading content into there as you can, as quickly as you can, until you finally fill it in. Right, so with this approach, it always feels like something's happening. You kind of have an expectation of what's to come because we have this grayed out or skeleton UI, right? So you set the expectations like this. Okay, there's some stuff coming down. You can kind of tell things aren't here. And immediately, as fast as possible, you try to load some of this content until you fill it in. Now, skeleton screens have become quite popular lately. Actually, sorry, one more thing I want to say before I say that. Pretend I didn't say that. The basic principle here is that you put the focus on the progress, not on the progress indicator, right? And there's a lot of research behind why this works. So number one, and I'm going to like sort of quote this so I don't get it wrong, occupied time feels shorter than unoccupied time. What that means is if you kind of keep people busy, time goes quicker, right? Anxiety, on the other hand, makes wait seem longer. So if you give people early feedback that what you want is happening, it's just not complete yet, that makes the wait feel more bearable. And uncertain waits feel longer than certain waits. So an uncertain wait is just like a spinner. You don't know what's going on. Whereas if we're gradually loading things in, we set an expectation of what's going to come, right? That feels shorter. And as I said, many people have now implemented skeleton screens. You can see them in Facebook, you can see them in Slack, you can see them in Medium. They're all over the place. They're kind of grayed out on the screen, but you get the idea. But the problem is, while they've made things that look like skeleton screens, they haven't embraced this principle of gradual content loading. What I mean by that is, in these examples, they sort of flash the skeleton screen at you, and then you see that for a while, and then everything comes in right away, right? And so you don't get this whole notion that they replace it with content. And as I sort of cited from kind of those principles of how we perceive time, a much more effective approach is to set expectations with the skeleton screen, but then load content into it gradually. Google Photos does a really nice job with this. I hope you can see this. It's not too washed out. So as you scroll through photos that aren't loaded yet, there's a skeleton UI that not only gives you a sense of how many images are in the section you're at, but also some useful information. So you can see we annotate videos, right? So you see a little video icon, tells you how much time it is. It's already informative before you even get it. We also reflect the proportions of images. So you can see this is going to be kind of a big panorama. Over there's a portrait. Over here, some landscape photos. So the skeleton screen itself is already useful. In fact, you may even be able to find something that you're looking for using this structure. And then on top of it, we use the skeleton UI as a basis for loading content. You can sort of see here, but there is a small, really tiny, stretched out preview version that gets grayed out to start gradually loading things, and that could help you find an image right away. And then the way the content is loaded, it's staggered based on where you're scrolling to, not where you've scrolled from. Right? So you start loading where you're going to as opposed to where you've been, so that the stuff is there for you when you get there. And this is counter to the way most people do loading, is they just start at the top of the screen and load the whole thing down instead of watching where you're at and adjusting the loading order to come in. So a lot of stuff. Here's a mobile example. You can see YouTube making use of the same idea here. Right? As you switch tabs in the YouTube app, you can see that there's a skeleton screen, but see the content load on top of it? You can see it sort of gradually fill in. Oh, hey, a little dialogue we can dismiss. Let me just show this again so you get the feeling, right? They have a skeleton screen, but they're gradually loading content into it and filling it in. So the expectations are set, and then content comes in there, right? Here is one last example just to emphasize how much time and effort you can really put into these interactions. So this is Google Maps. And again, you see sort of a skeleton UI. You see some of the basics of the interface. And then gradually, stuff loads in, including the content, and then you'll see these images come in at the very end, right? So there's a staggering effect. And let me kind of put this into a picture set so you can sort of see, right? And just look at the different layering that's going on. In the first version, there's the skeleton screen, right? And then you gradually start tiling some of the images. You bring in some of the core labels and content, homework. And then you bring in traffic info, you show how long it'll take to get there, you show the route. As you get more information, you bring more stuff in. And when people look at this, they're like, Luke, that's a lot of work. Is it worth all that time and effort? Again, I bring you back to the realities of mobile use. 80 times a day, less than 30 seconds. If there's a delay, it's super noticeable, and it's noticeable a lot of times. So yeah, it actually does pay off. It's one of the key things for designing for mobile. And by the way, I just have to do this quick aside here. I just want to point out all of these Google apps now use a bottom navigation bar. If you're interested in why I'm showing that, you can check out the Google Conversions YouTube channel for my obvious always wins talk, where I will go into a lot of detail on that. Aside over. So let's come back to what does mobile use actually look like so you can effectively design for it. What have we seen so far? 3.5 billion smartphones, 2 major platforms, shifting whole industries, 3 hours a day, mostly additive, happening in native apps, retaining people there is hard, do onboarding, use the web to get people in. And these 3 hours break out into many short sessions. Speed really matters. And it's not just actual speed, it's also perceived speed. And there's a bunch of techniques that you can use to manage this, even in cases where you just can't get the whole thing to go any faster, because that happens on mobile devices and mobile networks, right? So a lot that can be done with product design to manage expectations and perception of speed. All right. One more? One more. So I'm going to drill into how are people interacting with this stuff? And I'm going to take interacting with literally, as in how many people do actually interact, aka touch, and use their device. Any guesses how many times do people touch a smartphone a day? 180? 3,000? Pretty big range. Once? Okay, that's good. You're on a diet, I like that. A lot is the right answer. 2,617, which per year, that's about 1 million touches on average, right? And when I say touches, I mean keystrokes and taps and everything. This comes from a bunch of Android users where they basically tracked everybody's interaction 24 hours a day, 5 days, and kind of looked at what things amounted to. So if you average that out, right, per use, remember, 3 hours a day, 80 times a day, 2,600 touches, that's about 32 touches per use. And just for fun, because I like these little asides, everybody believes the iPhone X is expensive, right? Pretty expensive phone. Costs a lot of money, right? How expensive? Oh, it's like over $1,000 for the 256 gigabyte iPhone. But like, now bear with me for a second, okay? $1,100, pretty expensive phone. But, let's say you keep an expensive phone, whether it's an iPhone or Android, for about 2 years. It was 730 days. Okay? How much is that per day? It's like $1.50 a day to use it. Okay. How much is it per every time you open it? Well, you open it about 80 times a day, $1.50 a day. Is it like 2 cents every time you open it? And something like 0.0006 cents per touch. So is it expensive now? What do you touch more? Don't answer that question. Right as I said it, I stopped myself. Of consumer products. Wait, that's also not going to work well. Anyway, let's get off that topic. Let's instead look at these average users, right? So I said 2,600 average daily touches. Again, similar amount of daily usage in the study. It's also nice to see those numbers correlate. But lots of small kind of sessions in here, right? Of course, averages don't tell the whole story, so it's worth looking at some extremes. For example, heavy users. Heavy users are 2 million touches per year, right? It's almost double. 5,427 touches. Even more time spent on these devices. Now, what you see again is a lot of these sessions are short and bursty. They sort of echo the data we saw before. Long usage sessions are rare. They're mostly Netflix and reading. But in general, people prefer lots of little sessions with breaks in between them. That's the reality of how these mobile devices get used. What the average user's touches look like per day, you can see we do sleep a little bit, it is true, but most of the rest of the time we are actually on our phones. Right? A lot of phone touching throughout the day. And then looking at which apps get accessed within these sessions tells us not that many. More than half the time people picked up their phone, they only opened one app, 52% of the sessions. Another 40% of the time, people use just 2 or 3 apps. And again, we see engagement is sort of narrow, focused, right? not a ton of multitasking, which reflects some of the data we saw earlier. If you remember what I showed you from some of the other data sources we looked at, 50% of the time was spent in somebody's top used app. And I bring this up because it's always nice when very different methodologies and very different sources add up to a similar result. Like, at which point, by the way, that's when you can start believing things, in my opinion. When different methods, different audiences, different sources all kind of tell you the same thing, you're seeing the problem from a lot of different perspectives and understanding what's actually happening. What I've kind of come to believe about numbers is in order to really believe something, you need multiple sources. You need to throw out the lowest number, the highest number, and then average the others, and you're pretty good. Right? At that point, looks right. So it's nice to see these very different studies kind of land in the same place. And it gives me confidence that we actually these days have a pretty good sense of what's happening with mobile. Right? Okay, so what do these touches look like? That is, how are people actually holding these devices when they tap them 2,000 to 5,000 times a day? Looking at a bunch of observations of people in the street, there's a number of ways people hold their devices. Half the time it looks like this. 25% of the time they need another hand. 15% of the time they're doing the crackberry prayer. And 10% of the time they sort of switch fingers. Right? Now, what you may notice from this is there's a lot of thumbs. If you add up all the thumb pictures, right, the thummy things, you realize that the digit that's touching the screen 90% of the time in these things is this big fat thing right here. Pretty much you're dealing with a thumb. Now, don't get too fixated on the 90% number, because even if it was 45% of the time, half of that you're dealing with a thumb on screen, you still have to deal with the thumb. And what I mean by dealing with the thumb is the thumb is very imprecise. It impacts how you can and should design your apps. Because as touch targets get smaller, the number of mistakes people make get higher. And the average size of an index finger is about 11 millimeters over here, whereas the average width of a thumb is about 25 millimeters. Now, we don't touch with our entire thumb, right? We sort of punch with the sides. But once again, the point is this is a pretty blunt, imprecise instrument for smacking on things. The hand positions we use and that we saw have a really big impact on other things, like screen orientation. That is the way we hold our devices, and that impacts layout and design. So 3 to 7-inch smartphones are mostly in portrait mode. As you get to small tablets, that number starts to drop. When you get over to large tablets, the majority becomes landscape use, and by the time you get to TVs, it's pretty much 100% landscape use. And so what do you do about this, right? Well, the practical application is that you can actually design for things to work with one thumb in portrait mode. This is how we built our app Polar. You can see there's these huge touch things. You can just scroll with your fingers, with your big thumb. You can just vote on stuff, large touch areas. When you vote on something and then you scroll up from the bottom, it gives you a little tip right there that you can swipe across things you don't like. Big thumb-sized touch targets, and now you learned you can just swipe across things to skip things that you don't like, right? So you can just go skip across it. Again, a thumb gesture. If you want to get the menu, right, it's right there accessible. And then if you want to refresh, let me show this example. You just pull down, it reloads. And so lots of different ways that you can just sort of use this big fat digit to do stuff. You can design an app all around this orientation with one big fat digit just tapping on things. And then the other stuff that matters is we saw these touches are coming from thumbs, and in portrait mode, there's one more consideration, which is screen size. And again, I've shown this before, but I really like this transition where you go from 3 years ago or so, only 7% of smartphones were quote-unquote big, 5.5 to 6 inches, and now 40% of them are big. What does that mean? It means it gets harder to hit the top of the screen, right? Easier to hit here, harder to go there, which is why you start to see a lot of applications opt for these bottom panel controls. And what do I mean by a bottom panel control? Here you can see that there's a little thing with directions. If you flick it up, you get a lot more stuff. You can kind of flick it down. right? So a lot of controls and information are relegated to the bottom half of the screen and available through a pretty blunt, fat finger gesture. Right? Also note the size of these buttons. Similarly here, when you're in driving directions, note the big fat button, but again, you can kind of flick it up, more big fat buttons, you can flick it down. And so a lot of designing for this modality, this one hand, large screen, position things on the bottom, make it work for the thumb. In fact, people are building entire product categories about this, around this. Opera Touch is a browser that is literally designed to let you explore the web using just one hand. And if you see how this works, right, there's a little control thing here where you can jump between your favorite sites. You can see your open tabs. When you start scrolling, it goes away, it comes down, tap it again, you can refresh, come back, what have you. So the whole UI is built around one hand, one thumb, positioned at the bottom as screens get bigger. And it's not just apps that are accounting for this reality. If anybody remembers the way Palm Pre, this was a device that ran WebOS back in the day, it had this interaction paradigm where you would just sort of swipe up with the thumb and it would bring up all the open apps that you can move through. If you've ever used an iPhone X or you've seen the new Android P, you see that they're doing the exact same interaction paradigm at an operating system level, right? So now the whole functionality of the phone is driven by one-handed, bottom of the screen, accounting for thumb usage. So it's not just UI elements, it's not just apps, it's actually the whole operating system is working against this reality. And I sort of brought up the point that when you understand the reality of mobile use on our planet, you understand why speed matters so much. Here's another great example of how we are understanding how people use these devices in relation to their bodies, and the entire platforms that run on them are adapting to that, right? It's why this context matters so much, in my opinion. And speaking of that context, right, I'll layer just one more thing on top of this here. We talked about those 3.5 billion smartphones, the shifts to digital. We talked about those 3 hours in mobile apps. We talked about that they break down into all these short sessions. So speed matters, perception of speed matters. And now what we can add on here is that these short sessions mostly consist of one-handed, one-thumb use, mostly in portrait mode on large screens. And once again, you can account for this in your designs. Right? In fact, we can and should account for this reality by taking thumb flow, touch target sizes, call to action placements, all into account as we design for this reality of use. So while we've been looking at the world as it currently exists, right, I've shown this chart a few times, it's probably in many of your heads, well, Luke, well, that's where we're at now, 1.3 billion active smartphones, 3.5 billion smartphones, 1.3 billion active PCs. What's next? Are there any other technologies that are coming down the pipe that we need to be aware of, that we should be thinking about, that we should be designing for? Right? What's sort of the next thing on the radar? And to answer this question, it helps to map things out using my friend Tom Chi's product life cycle diagram. He came up with this many years ago now, but I still think it works, right? It's a very nice and simple way to think about the path products go from when they're kind of emerging, when they're new, when they're uncertain, to when they hit maturity, aka widespread use. So the first phase here is this emergent phase. Lots of stuff happening. No one really knows what's ultimately going to land. People don't really make money. The products aren't clear, right? Will people use this? How will they use it? For what will they use it? That's the emergent phase. Then we enter this kind of growth market phase. And in the growth market phase, use cases start popping up. Companies focus on these use cases. They start marketing against those use cases, and lots of growth happens. At the end of this growth phase, there's usually consolidation, so you may go down from 10 players down to 3 or something like that. Because at that point, you enter a mature market. In a mature market, there's much less players. People move really slowly between things. There's strong brand affiliation, right? And it's a pretty stable situation. However, it's only stable up until some kind of disruption happens. and then that market starts to decline. Now, it often declines quite gradually, so the obviousness of that decline isn't immediately apparent. And things linger. Everything lingers, right? So if I were to map this against what we've been talking about all day, which is like sort of smartphones, these hand computers, it's pretty clear these are in a mature market, right? Android and iOS are two major platforms, both hold many loyalists, huge numbers, big market penetration, right? Still growing. It's not done. Well, it's pretty clearly a mature market. PCs, that is desktop and laptops, in contrast, are on this side of the coin, right? They're in a declining market. And now, before you say, hey, Luke, desktops are still selling, let me give you a 10-year perspective, right? If we go back 10 years, there's about 240 million PCs shipped per year. Fast forward 10 years, it's only 262. We kind of already had a peak, and ever since then, we've been going down. Whereas if you contrast that to the mobile side, you can see not only is this line way, way bigger, but it's actually holding much more steady in terms of how many are shipped. Right? By the way, this is shipped, not growth in active users. Coming back to this, other kinds of technologies are on the rise. Now, what kinds of things could that be? Well, let's take a look at stuff like wrist computers and voice computers, smart speakers, smartwatches. We're in a period of very high growth for these kinds of devices. You've probably seen commercials for Amazon Alexa or Google Home, right? People are going crazy in this market. 1 in 6 Americans now own a smart speaker. That's up 128% from last year. Right, so it's about 16% of Americans that have a smart speaker, 39 million. Apple Watch, there's about 46 million sold. The user base is somewhere between 40 and 43 million. And you may have also seen this, but that watch has now outsold the entire Swiss watch industry. So a period of very high growth, right, for both of these things. And these devices have very different usage patterns than those of the smartphones we've been talking about today. For instance, not only are smartwatches used more times per day, that blue bubble, as opposed to that pink bubble right there, their sessions are even shorter than mobile sessions, an average of something like 7 seconds versus 30 seconds. Right? So over here is smartwatch, over here is a smartphone. And if you thought smartphone sessions were short, well, look at those smartwatch sessions. You can see this distinction across a wider range of screens as well. That is, the bigger a screen, the longer the sessions on it, but the less of them that happen. And the smaller the screen, the more sessions happen, but the shorter they are. Sort of a general trend. And what people use these devices for differs as well. If you compare these two form factors that I'm saying are on this growth curve, you can see smartwatches are primarily used for things like notifications, updates, activity tracking. Right? These are the kind of common use cases there. Whereas smart speakers tend to support things like playing music, checking the weather, setting timers, controlling lights. And I should point out that these use cases, which use cases resonate, isn't immediately clear when a device is in the emergent phase. For instance, when the Apple Watch was released, they said it's a precise timepiece, this intimate communication device where you can send your heartbeat to and from people, and a health and fitness tracker. Well, not all of these have panned out, right? Not a ton of people sending heartbeats back and forth using these watches. So the use cases that will emerge during a growth phase are not necessarily clear in the emergent phase. And also in the growth phase, devices can shift and adapt to account for emerging use cases. As an example, Google Home released this Max edition, which is optimized for listening to music. Or Amazon, which used to have just a sort of voice input and output system, now has a visual output. And note the use case they surface is showing weather. It's one of the top reasons people are using smart speakers, to check the weather. Right? So play music, show weather. Right? So the devices adapt and change, and then people market against those use cases as we are inside of this growth phase period. And the way to think about it is we're learning more about their use, we're learning more about their value, and adapting how we design for it. So things are not locked down here. There's still a lot more to learn. But it's a lot more stable than something that would be in the emergent category. And in the emergent category, I will put face computers. And by face computers, I mean things like augmented reality, virtual reality, lots of exploration here, lots of possibilities. But we're not yet at this very large stage of rapid growth. Many companies are exploring this space. But there's like very big open questions, such as what form of interaction is going to define this category? Are we going to augment reality by putting digital information and digital actions on reality? Are we going to put virtual objects into the real world in what some people call mixed reality? Or is it going to be virtual worlds, virtual objects, which is a little bit more like virtual reality? All right? If you ask me, I think this is still being worked out. I, for one, have long been interested in what real-time object identification coupled with simple action-based voice commands could be. Right, so a year ago, I started a series of some use case explorations that are really trying to figure out like what kinds of value can we extract for things like augmented reality. So what kind of real-time information could we maybe bring in to help you understand the world? Like explain to me what the hell these symbols are. Or allowing computers to do what they're really good at, like solving math problems. Pretty darn useful. Or helping translate the world to us in terms we understand. This doesn't necessarily mean language. It can mean a whole bunch of different things. Or what if we can now take action on what we find in the real world? Like we see some music, maybe we want to translate that directly into what it represents. Or other forms of taking action, like making a purchase based solely on what's in front of us at that time. Right? Lots of potential use cases here. This is the definition of an emergent category. Well, we could do this, we could do that, it could be this, it could be that. Not yet at the state where use cases are stabilizing. And also, in addition to working through use cases, there's also questions of like interaction paradigms. For example, in something like augmented reality where you have this heads-up display, how should you show information overlaying the real world? Should you bring up these dialogues? Should you try instead interact with the objects? Maybe text overlays make sense. How do you do this in a way that doesn't distract or harm people? Right? Like oculation, aka putting things in front of stuff that you're looking at, it's a pretty big deal, especially if you're moving, even if you're standing still. And then how do you trigger some of these interactions? Like, what's the controls for a face-based computer? Are you always touching glasses on your face? Is there some other kind of UI to trigger it? Could it be like a hand-based thing? Or maybe you can trigger audio commands, right? Like on a ring-based form factor or something. Right, so how do you turn on these voice commands so everything you're saying isn't flashing stuff in front of your eye? Lots of big unanswered questions. Maybe some companies have answers for these. Actually, I know some companies do have answers for these questions, but which one is right? Unclear. But regardless of how this emergent technology pans out, right, I think one thing is certain, which is in the future, we're no longer going to be designing for one type of device. Long gone are these days of the PC being the only thing that runs software in our lives. Right? Today's personal computer is the mobile device. But many people are now starting to experience multi-device experiences. And while for some of us, this is what a personal computer looks like today, right? It's a bunch of networked and connected devices. We're still the minority, right? Because for the majority of the world today, the smartphone is their personal computer and their primary way to access the sites and services and information that all of us work on each day. And as we approach the not too distant future, where smartphones reach even more of the planet, that opportunity is only going to increase. So the more we know about how to create great digital experiences, the better we can succeed and help our customers succeed on this mobile planet, right? And I won't belabor you with too much of what I've said before, but I do believe, this is a transformative planet scale thing we're dealing with. And so all the things you do to account for it really can pay off in huge, huge ways, in ways no other form of technology could reach people before. We know a lot now about the actual usage of how people interact with these things. How long, how often, in what ways. So we can really deal with prioritizing what we work on. For example, prioritizing speed or prioritizing these sort of one hand, one thumb interactions. And of course, things are always changing, so we need to prep for what's next, right? But it's also useful to keep that in context, meaning not everything is in a mature state of technology yet. And being able to think about, well, where is this really on that spectrum of device life cycles or technology life cycles helps us decide what level of attention we should pay towards it, right? It's always fun to think about the future, but personally, I would really start learning about new technologies that are at least growing, maybe emergent, right? Just for the simple sake that it's always better to be prepared than not. So, that's all I got for you today. Thanks.